It's great to be here on what's probably the craziest day of my life so far. Yeah, it's been really crazy and really nice. And this is my first real trip to Western Illinois / Eastern Iowa, I guess I should say too. And it's been really nice to be here and to stay with Kirsten and Sean, catch up with old friends, and make some new ones. Just one little word. I have two little words actually before I get started. The first is that if you're not a member of the Archaeological Institute of America and you think you might like to be one, you want to join. It's a big organization. It's a diverse organization that advocates and educates all kinds of archaeology of every kind. There's a tendency to think that the AIA is largely coterminous with classical archaeology, and that tends to be more true on the sort of academic wing of the AIA, but in terms of the larger mission of the AIA, that's really not the case. It really covers all kinds of archaeology, New World, Old World, Africa, Asia, and so on and so forth. So I would urge you, if you think that you're interested, to look into it. There's a website, archaeological.org, where you can find all kinds of information about membership plans, including discounted membership plans for students. And why are you not obeying my commands? Sorry. Okay, there we go. And your membership brings lecturers like me to Western Illinois, so you can hear about Mycenaeans and other kinds of things. So you'll actually be helping yourself if you do join the AIA. And if you do join, make sure to join the Western Illinois chapter. Don't join, the Chicago chapter or the Toronto chapter. The other thing is I am contractually obliged to, and I want to actually, talk about the fact that I'm the Rodney S. Young Lecturer this year for the AIA. So this lectureship was established in 1976 by the Philadelphia Society, and the Rodney S. Young Memorial Lecture was given in Philadelphia annually thereafter. But in 2001, thanks to the generous donations from AIA members nationwide, this lectureship was made part of the program administered by the AIA's headquarters, with lectures given around the country. Rodney S. Young earned his PhD in classics and archaeology from Princeton in 1940, excavating in the Athenian Agora and elsewhere in Greece as a student. He became curator of the Mediterranean section of the University of Pennsylvania's Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and he was professor of classical archaeology at UPenn in 1950. In the same year, he began new excavations in Gordian in Turkey, right, King Midas and all that good stuff, which he directed until his death in 1974. He was president of the AIA from 68 to 72, and he was the Norton Lecturer in 68 and 69. His interests included Greek and Phrygian archaeology and history, the early Iron Age, and early writing. And in addition to these subjects, he had a strong interest in the Mediterranean of his own day. He raised money for and he drove an ambulance in Greece after the Italian invasion in 1940, and he headed the Greece desk for Allied intelligence in Cairo after the US entered the war. So he's one of these archaeologist spies. And he served as a special assistant for post-war humanitarian relief in Greece. So, a distinguished scholar. It's my honor to be the Young Lecturer. And it's worth pointing out that I think something like 80% of the lecturers that are sent out by the nationwide chapter of the AIA are supported by endowed lectureships like the Rodney Young Lectureship. So, should you choose to give money to the AIA, your money would go to support outreach programs like this, lecturers like this. So, you can see a direct impact with your donations to the core mission of the AIA. Okay, so that's sort of prelude to the actual talk. The newest journal for scholars of the Mycenaean world, entitled Pasiphae, is odd in at least two ways. First, it's named for a mythological woman who copulated with a bull to produce a monstrous child, the man-eating Minotaur. Not really the most auspicious name for a journal, or at least not the name I would pick. Second, and more seriously rather, is its statement of purpose. And I quote, and for those of you who have Italian, there's the Italian. The Mycenaean world, out of whose ruins Greek classical civilization emerged, is known through the archaeological excavations of Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes, and thanks to the decipherment of Linear B, a syllabic writing system. Pasiphae has the aim of illustrating this rigidly hierarchical and centralized world, that's my emphasis, through the publication of original texts, the result of archaeological research, and of historical, philological, linguistic, and economic studies. I want to focus on this phrase, this rigidly hierarchical and centralized world. It might seem odd to you to celebrate the study of rigid hierarchy. It certainly does to me. And actually, this is more or less the accepted orthodoxy for the region and the period that the journal covers. Briefly stated, the Aegean Basin in the late Bronze Age, so about 1600 to 1200 BC, is the region that we're talking about. Oh, sorry, I didn't go forward. Go forward. So, you know why? Because I didn't turn this on. I'm really a genius. This is the Aegean Basin here. So mostly we'll be talking about southern Greece, and to a lesser extent, the island of Crete down here. For instance, a prominent Mycenaean archaeologist wrote in 1996 that, and I quote, "The palaces of the Greek mainland radically centralized all economic, administrative, and bureaucratic operations and monopolized all aspects of public life. The emergence of the Mycenaean palace states was further accompanied by the establishment of a centralized monarchy. The documents of the palace administration also testify to the fact that all affairs of state and all economic matters were under the paramount control of the monarchs," unquote. In my talk today, I will make the argument that this image of the Mycenaean social, political, and economic order needs to be radically revised. Come on in. Sorry. And I will focus particularly on society. There are two parts of my argument. The first is a critique of traditional models of Mycenaean society on methodological and empirical grounds. The second is a suggestion for one way we can move towards a better model of Mycenaean society. So, before I do that, I should probably provide a brief survey, a very brief survey, about what I'll be covering and the basis for my claims. So first of all, the term Mycenaean is a term that Greek archaeologists and historians use to cover the entirety of the late Bronze Age in Greece. So about 1600 to 1200 BC, or even into 1100, probably better. Geographically, the term Mycenaean is applied to much of the Greek mainland. It also includes the islands, especially Crete, which may have been invaded by Mycenaeans around 1500 BC. That's a controversial position, but it doesn't affect any of my claims here. Beginning in around 1400 BC, the first Mycenaean palaces are built, and their emergence is coincident with the use of the Mycenaean writing system. So here are many of the major palatial sites of the Mycenaean world, including, you'll notice, a new one that people have been asking about, Ios, very close to ancient and modern Sparta, which is a new site that's been excavated over the last couple of years. Okay. Mycenaeans used a syllabic script, which we call Linear B, which was used exclusively by palatial authorities for economic and administrative purposes. Its decipherment by Michael Ventris in 1952 demonstrated that it was used to write an early form of the Greek language. In addition to the important linguistic consequences of the decipherment, it also really changed the way that the Mycenaeans were interpreted. So prior to the decipherment, the archaeological record was combined with evidence from Homer to come up with a composite picture of Mycenaean politics and society, and the decipherment changed all that. The world that the Linear B tablets revealed shared little with the Homeric poems. So it's a really big change in the way that Mycenaeans were understood. So far as we can tell, the Mycenaean world was not politically unified. Instead, you had a handful of polities, independent from each other, but using very similar cultural forms. So pottery, architecture, writing, and so on. Although initially the similarities were so great that scholars spoke of a koine, there's now increasing appreciation for variation in ceramic styles, administrative organization, and so on. Mycenaean polities were generally not very large, nor were they very populous. So Pylos, for example, the Mycenaean center that we understand best, and the one that I understand best, seems to have controlled an area of about 2,000 square kilometers. That's about the size of a sort of regular Midwestern county, with a population estimated at 50,000 people. In this paper, I'm going to focus on the site of Pylos around 1200 BC. There are two good reasons for this. The first is that Pylos is the palatial center that we understand the best, both archaeologically and textually. The texts at Pylos are the best preserved in the Mycenaean world because the site was virtually abandoned after the destruction of the palace and because it was expertly excavated. As you'll see, my method requires a fairly coherent set of texts. The second reason, which is related to the first, is that Pylos provides the best evidence for Mycenaean social organization. Almost every synthesis of Mycenaean society actually describes Pelian society. So it's logical to begin a reevaluation of Mycenaean society with Pylos. The date 1200 BC is not my choice. Virtually all of the documents from Pylos, there are some exceptions, but they're few in number, date to 1200 BC. Indeed, they date to the last couple of months prior to the final destruction of the palace. So, in some ways, I'm not just talking about one Mycenaean center at the very end of the Mycenaean period. Oh, sorry. In some ways, I am really just talking about one Mycenaean center at the very end of the Mycenaean period. I knew that didn't sound right. My conclusion should not, therefore, be simply applied uniformly to all Mycenaean centers across time and space. On the other hand, it's also the case that the traditional orthodoxy is based on the same data set that I'm using. So although my discussion is limited to a single site in a single year, it has very broad implications for the study of the Mycenaean world. So, yeah, this is where Pylos is, and then here's a zoom-in map with a reconstructed boundary of the state of Pylos. It basically corresponds to the modern administrative district of Messenia. Okay. Let me move on then to the traditional model of Mycenaean society. The social and economic structures of the Mycenaean world have been described in terms of strict hierarchy since the decipherment of Linear B. Sir Moses Finley, in an influential article written just after the decipherment in 1957, argued that the palatial economy was a redistributive system in which the center virtually monopolized and coordinated all production, consumption, and exchange, and his model remains influential. Such extreme economic centralization is difficult to imagine in the absence of a social structure that's correspondingly rigid. In fact, Finley described the Mycenaeans in precisely the same way that he describes contemporary Near Eastern kingdoms, rigid, top-down structures. So just one quote, the Linear B tablets reveal a massive redistributive operation in which all personnel and all activities, all movements of both persons and goods, so to speak, were administratively fixed. Okay. Traditional studies of Mycenaean society, therefore, always begin with the wanox, the king. There he is, at the top of the pyramid. And then move to other offices known from the textual evidence. This approach is explicitly bureaucratic. Offices are isolated. This isn't usually hard because there are Mycenaean names for most of these offices. Their functions are determined, if possible, and then individual offices are placed in a schematic chart like this one, which I've redrawn from a classic article in Mycenaean archaeology and updated to reflect current thinking. So you have at the top of the pyramid, the gods, I guess, the Wanaks as this human intermediary between the gods and the rest of society. This guy called the Lalagetas, who might be the sort of military commander of the Mycenaean world. Then some other officers, including priests and priestesses. And then at the bottom, slaves or dependent, what I've called dependent laborers, local communities, and smiths. Okay, the offices are usually divided into 2 or 3 groups, but usually 3. You have palatial administrators, right here at the top, whose authority is polity-wide, local administrators with regional authority, and non-elites with no titles and no authority. Elites are therefore defined as those who hold an official title within the palatial administration, and so they constitute a relatively small group. There are about 20 palatial administrators and another 80 or so local administrators. So we'd be talking about 100 guys and a couple of girls running the whole kingdom in this traditional model. This model is depressingly generic. So much so that if we accept it, there's virtually no point in talking about Mycenaean officialdom. We could just plug in the generic model that's typically applied to early states. Bruce Trigger, for example, writes in his comparative study of early civilizations that, and I quote, "The highest state officials belonged to the upper classes, and together with the king they made all the most important decisions. Members of this group also commanded the army and managed the major religious institutions. Less prestigious members of the nobility were minor officials," and so on and so forth, right? So this model of Mycenaean officialdom basically just corresponds to the way that a lot of archaeologists think about the earliest states. Top-down, hierarchical, a couple of guys in control, and then you've got some losers at the bottom who basically just take orders from the top. I suppose that some would see that as confirmation of its truth. That is to say, the Mycenaean case corresponds to the comparative framework drawn out by Trigger. And in fact, a prominent archaeologist recently said as much in his blog. According to him, the Maya can't have a middle class because all ancient civilizations had 2 classes, elites and non-elites. Okay, great. So we don't need evidence after all. We can just, but there are a number of problems with the usual picture of this 2-tiered or even 3-tiered Mycenaean social structure. In fact, it's hard to take the textual data at face value. Mycenaean documents don't provide an even or thorough picture of Mycenaean society, in large part because the authors of these documents were interested in composing short and efficient economic records, not in helping us to understand Mycenaean society. Official titles are only included on texts where they're somehow necessary to the administrative purpose of the document. So here's a list of smiths who are going to do some metallurgical work for the palace, and they're just identified by name. They're called smiths, right? Because the header of the tablet says this Kalkewe, smiths, was it Tarasian Echontes, having an allotment of metal. And then you have a list of all the smiths that have an allotment of metal, and then you have a list of the smiths who are not allotted metal. So the scribe doesn't record all the information he knows about every individual smith. He just writes his name because that's sufficient to identify the smith, and that's all the scribe cares about. Okay. Okay, thus, a man who is a priest may hold land, but the scribe will only note that he is a priest if his office is the basis for his landholding claim. And even then, he may not record it. So here we have a guy named Sakereu, who is identified in this tablet as the priest. He has a particular kind of plot that measures out that we would need 576 liters of grain to sow. And the same guy appears in another tablet. We're almost 99.9% certain that this is the same person, the exact same person, but he's not listed as a priest, right? So if we didn't have this tablet, we wouldn't know he's a priest. right? But the scribe isn't interested in recording every single time, every single thing he knows about every single person, right? It's also the case that not everyone in the polity will have been monitored by the administration. Of the 50,000 individuals estimated to have lived in the Pylian kingdom, only some 4,100 are mentioned in the tablets, so under 10%, of which fewer than 1,000 are identified by name. Second, the palaces directly controlled only a segment of the total economy. The economic role of the palaces has traditionally been considered central and dominant, on the basis of the range and depths of its interests. But recent work has shown that the activities under direct palatial control were limited to specific economic fields and tended to be geographically proximate to the palatial center. The palaces instead had selective interests and activities that individually and collectively emphasized the symbolic importance of the center, and that perhaps cultivated the goodwill of local elites and the population at large. It's nevertheless clear that even if we adhere to the view that the palaces were central to the Mycenaean economy, they did not encompass the entire economy, nor were they the only institutions of significance. There was therefore room for individuals to operate on the edges of and outside of palatial authority, both economically and socially. A third criticism is that the traditional model is based not on an analysis of individuals or of practices, but ultimately of words, especially official titles and occupational terms. That is to say, it's lexically oriented, perhaps as a result of the lexicographical bent of work on the Mycenaeans immediately post-decipherment. So immediately after the decipherment, everyone was like, oh, look at all these Greek words we have, right? And they were trying to connect the dots between Linear B words and words that we knew from later Greek texts. This has two important consequences. First, an occupational group, for example, smiths, is treated not as a set of individuals who happen to do a specific type of work, but as a homogeneous group. Thus, variation within a group is suppressed even when there's evidence to suggest otherwise. Second, there's a presumption that lexical designators indicate social roles that totally determine an individual's status and identity. Thus, if a man is labeled as a smith, then that is presumed to be his only social role, excluding others and exhausting what can be said about him. So the central problem, sort of bringing this section to a close, with reading Mycenaean society straightforwardly from the texts, is that it conflates and confuses the administrative terminology of palatial administrators with reality. The nature of the documents is such that scribes record only the information that's directly relevant to the composition of the document that they're writing. As I mentioned above, scribes don't record everything they know about each person or each group that they record. The terms used by scribes also need not represent categories of identity that would have been embraced by the individuals affected. It may have been useful for scribes to designate individuals as smiths, but it need not follow that the smiths constituted a coherent group or identified themselves as such, right? Just like when you fill out a form and you're asked to check off your ethnicity, the categories that are listed don't have to be the categories that you identify as, right? They may seem weird and foreign to you. This tendency to approach society through words can create significant distortions of the evidence. A good example of this effect is the coinage of a modern term, collector, where no Mycenaean title exists. So collectors are men who are not provided with an official title in the text. They're identified only by their personal names. They initially were called collectors by modern scholars because they're associated at Pylos with the term agora, collection, in the context of animal husbandry. And it's still not clear what this term collection means and what the collectors did. So here's a tablet, CN 655, which records flocks of sheep that are allocated to herders at specific places. So there's a specific formula. First, the scribe writes the toponym, where the sheep are being kept. Then in the nominative case, if you don't know what that means, don't worry, it's not important. The herder's name is indicated. Then the name of the collector is indicated in the genitive case. Then you have the word collection. sometimes, not always. And then you have the sex and the number of the sheep. So in this case, it's 70 male sheep that are being kept by Iwa, so under the collection of Wedaneros. Okay. So strictly defined, there are 4 collectors at Pylos and 25 at Knossos. At Knossos, collectors also appear on tablets in the textile industry, from shearing to the final delivery of finished cloth to the palace. These texts don't exist at Pylos, so we don't know if the collectors also did this at Pylos. But what's interesting is that recent work has expanded the application of the term collector to include other named individuals who are responsible for important economic activities under palatial purview. Although the precise status and function of the collectors are unclear, the fact that their responsibilities are recorded alongside and in parallel to non-collector entries suggests that their activities were well integrated into the palatial economic system. Most scholars categorize the Pelian collectors as palatial administrators and treat them like other named officials. So here they are, collectors, right? This approach is grounded in the traditional bureaucratic model of palatial authority, in which offices are delimited in terms of their powers, positioned in a hierarchy of decision makers, and abstracted from their office holders, like in a modern bureaucracy. It's clear, however, that individuals could and did hold more than one office at a single time. And so it follows that the conflation of the activities of individual office holders with the functions of the office itself cannot be taken for granted. At Pylos, the activities of the collectors are strikingly diverse, presenting a bewildering array of potential functions. So why would you lump them into a single category? The answer is that as individuals, they don't fit into the rigid framework of Mycenaean officialdom. There's no place for them in this chart. So the creation of the office of collector becomes necessary to understand them. So if we take a step back, we can see that this model has insuperable problems, or I'm claiming that it has insuperable problems. Individuals can hold multiple positions at once. Some of the most important actors lack official titles, right? These collectors are not called collectors by the scribes. They're just names. It follows that the Mycenaean state can't be adequately comprehended as a static hierarchy of offices. And consequently, neither can the structure of Mycenaean society be derived from this rigid model. So, I've argued that the conventional models of Mycenaean society are deficient on grounds that their reliance on administrative terms yields a rigid social structure in the image of the state, populated by social roles. I also pointed out that this model has difficulties accounting for activities outside of direct palatial control and for the internal heterogeneity of the political order. My own solution to this problem is to focus on the activities of persons rather than impersonal institutions and offices. This moves us away from conflating society with administrative terminology and should allow us to examine the heterogeneity that we see in the texts. It also increases the amount of information at our disposal. As I mentioned above, the number of officers in the tablets is relatively small, about 100 people. But there are nearly 1,000 individuals identified by name in the Pylos corpus. These named individuals represent only some 2% of the estimated total population of the state, but something like 6.5% of the adult male population, because most of these named individuals, sadly, are men, about 95% of them. And I think we can probably assume that they're adult men. They're not like 2-year-old kids or whatever. Which isn't a bad sample for the ancient world, actually, I think. 6.5%, that's okay. Actually, that's great. I should add at this point that the evidence as it relates to these individuals is selective in 2 key respects. First, these are not a random selection of Pelians, but they are those who interact with the palatial administration directly in particular contexts, essentially where it makes sense to write down their names. Also, those who appear in the text that have a long shelf life. And this requires a little bit of explanation. So linear B texts were recycled. we have pretty good reasons to believe that they were recycled. These were temporary administrative documents. Some were recycled basically on a monthly basis. Some are totally contingent, right? They're just one-off ad hoc texts, and some appear to be held for yearly accounts. So for example, taxes are paid on a yearly basis, so it makes sense to keep tax records around for a year, right? Texts that go on a monthly basis, you're going to scrap them after you don't need them anymore. So the destruction tends to do a better job of preserving texts that are composed on an annual basis, and then a less good job of texts that are composed on a monthly basis, and a much less good job of preserving texts that are contingent, right, that are just one-offs. So that's the first thing. The second thing is because our documents are laconic administrative texts, they only provide the evidence that was directly relevant to the scribes. So what we can deduce about these individuals is limited by the goals of the scribal administration. So they're not interested, for example, in the names of the fathers of most men, or the names of the sons of most men. So we can't derive like family trees and that kind of stuff. Fortunately, the evidence is relatively abundant. The largest category of the Mycenaean lexicon consists of the personal names of men and women who are responsible for goods and services which fall under palatial purview. So the most common words we have are names. So we're talking about smiths who work bronze allocated by the Pylos, herders who manage palatial flocks, landowners, supervisors of work groups, and so on and so forth. These tablets are unpretentious documents that deal with the day-to-day operations of the palace. This is kind of disappointing for historians who would prefer texts that illuminate political and social history. And for this reason, Linear B documents are sometimes called laundry lists by people who think that they are boring. But this specificity permits a detailed picture of the daily operations of the palatial administration and the role of individuals in these practices. Practically speaking, the data set I'm using consists of all the personal names from the site of Pylos. That's 707 complete words, definitely identified as personal names, with an additional 231 fragmentary or uncertain names, bringing the total to 938. In order to be relevant to the study of Mycenaean society, however, these names have to be associated with specific individuals through some kind of prosopographical analysis. Traditionally, Linear B scholars have been skeptical of making prosopographical identifications for two reasons. First, Linear B tablets typically provide fairly little information about the individuals involved. Additional information, like official titles, are rare, and patronymics are very rare. Second, most of the people identified by name were assumed to be low-status laborers who should not be expected to recur in other tablets. So for example, if we have a guy named Hector in this text, we don't. He does exist at Pylos, but he's not here. And we have a guy named Hector from this text. Can we make the leap that they're the same person? Or would we just have two guys named Hector, right? Like the way we could have two guys named Mike or George or something like that. On the other hand, the Pelian documentation is unique in its scope and concentration with respect to time, space, and function. Okay. Linear B texts are highly laconic records relating to the internal operations of the palatial economy and temporary documents, covering at Pylos probably 5 to 7 month period. At Pylos, all of the texts date to the year of the final destruction of the palace, with a couple of exceptions around 1200 BC. They were also all found in the palace proper, and indeed most were found in a small 2-room archives complex. So what this slide is supposed to show you is that a huge percentage of all of the documents at Pylos are found in these 2 rooms. That's what this big red dot is. And the other smaller red dots show you locations of other tablets. So I think something like 88% of all the documents are found in this very small, concentrated area. From a prosopographical perspective, these conditions are very attractive. Although there are no universal criteria for what makes a plausible identification of individuals from names, potential matches can be eliminated if the documents in question differ in chronology or if they refer to different cities or regions. These problems don't intrude upon the Pelian data because all the individuals in the Pelian corpus automatically satisfy these criteria. All the texts date to a single year, and they relate to individuals and institutions within a single, relatively small polity. Another important consideration is that, although patronymics are very rare, Mycenaean naming practices are such that there are lots and lots of names relative to the number of individuals, even if you're super skeptical about these prosopographical identifications. So at Pylos, there are probably 788 individuals sharing 707 names, so 1.11 individuals per name. Or if you take a very skeptical view, 865 individuals sharing 707 names, so 1.22 individuals per name. So we're not dealing with a situation like, modern America, where you could have lots of people in this room with the same name. The most popular name at Pylos is probably shared by 4 different individuals. So we're not dealing with a situation where like lots of people are named Michael or something like that. Okay, I don't have the time, and you're not interested, I hope, in the nitty-gritty of Mycenaean prosopography, but that makes up basically the bulk of my study. In the series of chapters in my book, I show that not only is it possible to make prosopographical identifications with various levels of certainty, so I have certain, I have probable, I have possible, I have unlikely, but also that in most cases, multiple attestations of the same name refer to a single individual. Although individual matches can be debated, the cumulative weight of these identifications is difficult to ignore. It's also worth noting that the number of these matches should be considered a minimum figure, since the fragmentary nature of the data set inhibits our ability to argue for identification. So if I have a really fragmentary text with 2 names in it, I can't really do anything with that, right? If the text were fuller, I might be able to realize connections that would allow me to make an identification. So this can be illustrated by the fact that the rate of probable prosopographical matches increases substantially when dealing with the names of smiths and herders. So you can see here that for names in more than one series, that is to say, so a series is a type of document, right? So names in more than one series, there's 190 of these, and 72% of the time I figure with certainty or with probability I can say these are the same guys, right? But when I'm dealing with smiths and herders, I can say that they're certain or probable 93% of the time. And that's because the texts that preserve smiths and herders are very well preserved texts. So I can see patterns in the text that will allow me to make probable prosopographical matches. So the problem is a lack of positive evidence, not the presence of negative evidence, if that makes sense. So there's actually only 1 or 2 cases where I can prove that the same name is shared by 2 different people. In all other cases, I just don't have the evidence to prove that they definitely refer to one person. So we can conclude a great deal from these data. First, named individuals were a heterogeneous group. Of course, they differ in their activities, but even within a given group, such as herders, there's considerable variation. Most herders appear only once. Others are listed against more than one flock. These flocks may be located at the same place or at more than one place in the same region, or their flocks may be disparate and far-flung. Still, other herders are involved in other activities besides herding. Now, a man listed against one flock of sheep could be a full-time shepherd. Like, that's all he does, right? But he must have had extensive personal holdings of sheep, or at least access to them, since it was apparently the responsibility of the shepherd to keep the palace's flock at full strength. On the basis of the Canossian evidence, Paul Halstead has suggested that the average shepherd must have had considerable private flocks, on average 160 sheep, which is a lot for Greece, to maintain palatial flocks at full strength. So basically the palace would give me 100 sheep and say, you owe us this much wool every year, and you need to keep these sheep alive. And if a sheep dies accidentally or of old age, it was my responsibility to keep the flock at full capacity. So, sheep are going to die. That's a fact of life. So that means that if I'm a palatial herder, I need to have access to sheep. Either I need to have my own sheep or I need to get sheep from other people, which means I'm not nobody, right? But when the same man is listed against two flocks at two different locations, he cannot be personally herding both of them, right? Because he can't be in two places at the same time. So we actually have really good evidence for men who are involved in activities that are both different economically and located in separate parts of space. So a good example is a man named Awexos. He's got red dots. Awexos, he's the augmenter or something like that, right? Who herds palatial sheep in the northwest and southwest sections of the Palatial, right, northwest and southwest, and who's also a smith in the northwest, right, so he's also smithing up here. Another example is Plutos, Mr. Wealthy, right, Mr. Wealth. Plutos is Greek for wealth, who's a smith in the southwest, tends sheep in the northwest, and tends goats in the northeast, over here. These locations are approximate, right? It doesn't really matter. It seems, therefore, that these men were not necessarily required to carry out all of these tasks personally, but instead they were simply responsible for ensuring that they were carried out, either by doing it themselves or by delegating it to dependents or kin. This conclusion is new, right? Most scholars have assumed that these men were humble herders in the field, despite the fact that the texts say nothing to us about their social role. The Smiths don't call them herders. They just list the name of the herder against the number of sheep, or whatever. Some of the herders can probably be identified as fairly important figures, as it turns out, including some individuals that have been identified by others as collectors in the broader sense of the term, meaning important actors outside of the textile industry. So named herders ranged widely in importance. Some were probably herders in the field or low-level herding supervisors, whereas others moved in elevated circles among the administrative elite. This same pattern also applies to smiths, a group that has also been traditionally considered uniformly low status. Most smiths appear only once in the texts as recipients of metal, others as multiple recipients of metal at different locations, and still others appear in other administrative capacities, as herders, as landowners, as military officers, and so on. Now, there are reasons to believe that there's a correlation between how many times a person appears in the documentation and his or her standing in the palace. The more times an individual appears in the tablets, the more important and varied and spatially dispersed his or her responsibilities tend to be. And as this chart shows, most individuals only appear once in the tablets. So tablets are in yellow, right? Most of the individuals only appear one time, and then you have a pretty steep curve down. These curves actually correspond fairly well to a Pareto distribution, suggesting that there were inequalities in participation in palatial activities, as we would expect. It's also the case that those individuals who appear on the most tablets comprise some of the most important agents in the palatial administration. So, for example, 3 of the 4 most commonly occurring names are those of collectors, and the 4th is the most prominent of the followers, a high-ranking military office. So there are 2 general conclusions we can reach here. First, there aren't clear ranks and status among the named individuals, but rather they fall along a continuum of importance from minor figures that appear only once to frequently attested individuals engaged in a wide range of activities. Second, those individuals who appear in multiple texts are generally not specialists. Thus, it's rare to find an individual who appears in many tablets of the same type. Instead, these men and women tend to be involved in multiple types of activity within palatial purview. Both of these conclusions are the opposite of the expectations of the traditional model, in which individuals should be assigned administrative or professional roles with specific rights and specific responsibilities. There are also reasons to believe that certain responsibilities were allocated to individuals with influence generally, and not just those with influence in the palace. I already mentioned that herders of palatial flocks must have had fairly large private flocks. Indeed, their flocks would have been enormous by classical Greek standards. Multitasking individuals must have been able to mobilize labor through kin or personal connections in order to maintain their multiple responsibilities in the palace. Another example is the institution known as the Damos. So in later Greek, Damos means people or village, but in the Mycenaean period, the Damos is a corporate body distinct from the palace that administers agricultural concerns. Essentially, it's a kind of agricultural co-op. In one district at Pylos, the Davos is comprised of, or controlled by, a group of men called the plot holders. We know the names of 12 of these men, and my prosopography shows that 3 of them can be identified with certainty as smiths, with a 4th identification classed as possible. So some named individuals were stakeholders in important regional institutions. So they're, the head of the agricultural co-op, which is, not nothing. So the evidence taken as a whole indicates that named individuals were not simply important agents in the palatial system, they were also important in other institutions and in their local communities. They had substantial holdings of their own. Although they often do not possess official titles, we have good evidence for their importance to the palace, namely direct attestations of their activities and responsibilities. I'd argue, therefore, that most or perhaps even all of the named individuals in the tablets were part of one broad elite group that interacted with the palace. Numerically, this is plausible. There's about 800 individuals attested in the tablets, and if we bump this up to 1,000, trying to account for fragmentary texts and texts that are lost and so on and so forth, this still constitutes only 8% of the adult male population, a figure that's well within the range of the size of elite groups in other ancient societies. I would go a step further to argue that the individuals in the tablets engaged voluntarily in palatial activities. First, there are good reasons to suspect that engagement in the palatial economy provided a benefit to them. Herders stood to profit materially and symbolically from their relationship to the palace, because the palace wasn't interested in specific animals. This left the herders free to swap animals freely between palatial and private flocks. At Knossos, there's evidence that herders swapped their own yearlings into palatial flocks, taking out palatial ewes for their private flocks, presumably to boost expansion of their own flocks, right? So you want female women. You want female sheep in your flocks, right? Because the more female sheep you have, the more sheep you're going to have in the future. At Pylos, smiths were granted tax exemptions. Plots of land were also apparently allocated to craftsmen in compensation for their services, and the palace allocated material tokens of status to individuals. So individuals stood to make significant gains through participation in the palatial economic system, but this need not have been their only or even their primary motivation. If we see the palatial system as an arena of competition for influence and authority, then individuals may have seen participation in palatial activities as a way, or even the way, to maintain their standing in the community. The palace also gained from this arrangement. It seems clear that many economic fields monitored by the palace rely on resources outside of palatial purview. In the text, we don't see state-run agricultural estates, we don't see large flocks under direct palatial control, and we don't see metallurgical workshops. Instead, these activities are split up and parceled out, perhaps even contracted out, if we can speak of contracts, to specific individuals. Rather than having extensive state-run undertakings, the palace was apparently content to allocate jobs to individuals who were responsible for their completion. These palatial systems presuppose the existence of, and indeed make effective use of, non-palatial practices and resources that must have already been in place, right? Because herders didn't begin keeping private flocks in response to demands that they maintain palatial herds at full strength, right? It worked the other way around. These palatial systems must have come into being in response to earlier conditions. It's plausible that these palatial systems have very deep roots and reflect the traditional economic interests of early Mycenaean elites. It therefore seems that the palatial economy emerged in large part by successfully integrating the personal holdings of elites and local communities into palatial systems of production. This integration was not absolute, however, and involved significant levels of cooperation between the palace and individuals and communities. Okay, so in conclusion, previous approaches argue that the Mycenaean state virtually monopolized public affairs through a simple but powerful bureaucratic mechanism. This understanding has framed the interpretation of Mycenaean society such that emphasis has been placed on institutional roles and their position in the administrative system. Reanalysis of the prosopographical record suggests, however, that we need to abandon the strict model. Instead of modeling the palace at Pylos as a bureaucratic entity that determines social structure, we can consider it an arena of interaction and competition populated by individuals and groups with various agendas and resources. This way of thinking provides a number of advantages, I think. First, it allows us to account for all of the textual evidence. Rather than focusing exclusively on offices, it adds information about some 800 individuals. Second, it's more fluid and it can account for change over time. In the traditional model, change is difficult to explain because each social role is fixed by the central authority. Thus, only the collapse of the palace can create the potential for change. In my model, change is the product of shifting interactions between individuals, groups, and institutions. Third, this approach integrates study of the palace with that of society, rather than seeing the palace as something distinct from society at large. Many scholars have seen the Mycenaean palace as being only superficially connected to its broader socioeconomic context, or they've seen it as a centralized hierarchical system in contrast to the anti-system of Mycenaean society. This is actually a term that was coined by one scholar. While such proposals may explain the demise of the Mycenaean palatial system, essentially the palaces collapsed because they were too rigid, they struggle to explain its emergence and its internal operation, issues that the elite competition and integration model, that's sort of my way of summarizing what I think in a couple of words, addresses well. In fact, recent scholarship on the Greek city-states of the Archaic period, so basically 750 BC to 480 BC, also explains many social and political developments via elite competition. And this is not to say that I think that the rules of the game were the same in Mycenaean Greece and Archaic Greece. Obviously they weren't, but it does suggest that such models are useful in different historical contexts. And before I list the fourth and last advantage of approach, I also want to admit some limitations. First, despite the fact that this work opens up the study of the Mycenaean state and society quite a bit, it's still quite limited in scope, because about 90% of the population remains textually invisible. We're still talking about elites, almost all of whom are men. Because Linear B is a script used for purely institutional purposes, no quantity of new texts will change this situation, I suspect. The other feature of Linear B, the one that draws comparison to laundry lists, is its bare-bones economic nature. Perhaps this is one reason why much of my discussion tends to focus on economic activities and socioeconomic interest in scare quotes. The individuals in my study are described as competitive Mediterranean aggrandizers, not unlike Homeric chieftains or the Kabyle of Pierre Bourdieu, if you've read Bourdieu. I don't have a very strong theory of the Pelian individual, which is not something that the textual evidence allows for anyway. The category of the individual is problematic for many critics, but as an analytical category, it's crucial to my work, and for that matter, it's crucial to the work of the Mycenaean scribes. In any case, I'm not trying to make a universal claim about human nature, that men like to compete for status all the time, in all places and times, but rather a more limited claim about individual interactions in one particular field, that is to say the palatial sphere in Mycenaean Pylos. That is, a model in which individuals act as if they're aiming to maximize their social and economic standing does a reasonably good job of explaining the patterns in the data. The other thing I would say is that my model allows us to avoid the mistake, which is common in Mycenaean studies, of seeing the individual as somehow external to state and society. So traditional models of Mycenaean society have encouraged the view that people either belong to the palace and they obediently work away for the good of the institution, or they're non-palatial free agents working for their own self-interest. This tendency to categorize individuals as rigid conformists or independent nonconformists, I think, confuses more than it helps. The only way to supersede these limitations is to turn to the archaeological evidence. And this, I suggest, is the fourth point in favor of my approach. My model tallies much better with the archaeological evidence, in large part because it allows for the messiness and variability of social life by refusing to reduce individuals and households to administratively fixed roles. So, for example, on the basis of the archaeological evidence, Jim Reitz has suggested that the standardization and development of the Mycenaean drinking service was driven by demand for statusful commodities by a broad and diverse elite group who were intimately involved in the operation of the palatial sphere. This group of individuals can plausibly be correlated with the elite multitaskers named in the Pylos text, and I could name lots of different examples of this type. So, Mycenaean archaeologists have a hard time distinguishing between different ranks of houses and tombs that they excavate. It seems clear to me that if we're going to make significant progress in the study of Mycenaean society, a necessary development is the use of models that encourage archaeological and textual data to talk productively to each other. Thanks very much.